He didn't love her. Not really. He married her for business because the board liked her silence, her stillness, her face always hidden behind that veil. They thought she wouldn't interfere, wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't matter. But at a gala full of CEOs and cameras, she took off that veil. And for the first time, the room didn't look at him. If you believe that what we choose to hide sometimes holds the greatest power, stay with us. And if it moves you, like, subscribe, or leave a thought, we'd love to hear it. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria had hosted heads of state, foreign dignitaries, and the country's elite for generations. But that evening, under the gilded ceiling and crystal chandeliers, it stood quieter than ever. No music, no bouquet, no toast, just Nathaniel Ellsworth, the 36-year-old heir of Ellsworth Capital, standing beside a woman no one had seen before, at least not without her veil. Soraya Adisa entered the room like a whisper. Her gown, simple and elegant, moved soundlessly over the marble floor. But it was the veil, an opaque drape of ivory lace covering her face, that drew every eye. There was no father giving her away, no bridesmaids flanking her side, just her, walking alone, the only sound her heels making the slightest echo in the hush of the guests. Nate didn't flinch. His posture was military, straight-backed, arms folded behind him like he was waiting for a verdict rather than a bride. He hadn't spoken to her since the terms of the will had been delivered 3 months earlier. Marry by the end of the fiscal quarter, or forfeit the controlling shares of Ellsworth Capital. The name Soraya Adisa had appeared in a sealed envelope, and with it, a legal agreement already signed by her. No photo, no explanation, no loophole. When the officiant asked if they took each other as husband and wife, Nate gave a nod. Soraya, calm and unreadable beneath the veil, spoke a quiet "I do." Her voice didn't tremble. The ceremony ended without applause. Guests shuffled, whispered. One investor muttered, "Must be hiding something." A woman in pearls whispered, "Burn victim, maybe, or worse." But no one dared say it loud enough for Nate to hear. Back at the Long Island estate that night, Nate wandered through the main hallway, noting details he rarely paid attention to. The thermostat was set correctly for the first time in weeks. The burned-out sconce on the stairwell now glowed softly. The mail, usually left in a stack on the foyer table, had been sorted into labeled trays. Even the kitchen, usually a mess from late-night staff traffic, was pristine. He climbed the stairs, loosened his tie, and passed the library. A dim light glowed beneath the door. He paused, listened. Inside, papers shuffled, pages turned, a chair creaked, someone she was reading. He didn't knock. Instead, he kept walking to his room, his pulse slightly irregular, the silence of the house now filled with something he couldn't name. Later, lying awake, he thought of the veil, not as fabric, but as boundary, between them, between her and everyone else. In his mind, the ballroom replayed, the way she stood alone, the way she said "I do" without flinching. She hadn't asked for this, neither had he. But something told him she had come here with a plan. Morning at the Ellsworth estate usually began with the mechanical elegance of routine silver laid out by 7, coffee poured by 7:30, the sound of shined shoes tapping across stone floors by 8. But on the first full day after the wedding, Nathaniel Ellsworth entered the dining room to find a strange silence. The long mahogany table was set, 10 chairs polished, but only one was occupied. The butler nodded wordlessly. No Soraya, no explanation. Nate sat at the head of the table, stirring his coffee without drinking. His eyes scanned the empty chair at the far end, the one meant for a wife. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like avoidance. Upstairs. The third-floor study was where Nate usually reset himself. The floor-to-ceiling windows gave him a view of the back garden, stiff rose bushes wrapped in winter mesh, and a wooden swing swaying gently in the wind. His mother used to sit there, wrapped in a shawl even on warm days. That memory rose, uninvited. He shut the blinds halfway and opened his laptop, but something was off. The unread emails were sorted. A flagged report from 3 days ago was now neatly categorized, highlighted, even footnoted. The quarterly review binder had fresh tabs in colors he didn't use. At first, he assumed his assistant had come in early. Then he checked the timestamp. The changes had been made after midnight, elsewhere in the house. Soraya was not idle. In the back utility corridor, she spoke softly with the cleaning staff, handing them revised schedules and new suppliers for eco-friendly cleaning agents. In the library, she annotated spine labels with finer categories. In the basement, she reorganized the archival financial records. She never asked permission. She didn't need to. Instead, she left notes, handwritten, precise, no flourish, no signature, but always ending with a quiet directive like, "Let efficiency speak before anyone else does." That afternoon, Nate stepped into the west hallway and caught a glimpse, just a shadow of Soraya's silhouette through the frosted glass. The light passed through the veil she still wore, catching it like silk in sunlight. He opened his mouth to speak, but when he stepped forward, the hallway was already empty. No door creaked, no whisper of footsteps, just the faint scent of something warm, cinnamon, maybe, and the quiet pulse of order filling the house. Later that evening, as Nate was reviewing the potential acquisition of SharpTech, a notification blinked on his screen. It was from the legal division. Subject: urgent anomalies. SharpTech valuation attached was a spreadsheet. Not the standard one. This one had been dissected, color-coded, with clear marks pointing to inflated EBITDA claims and pending legal disputes quietly buried in the footnotes. Notes in the margin asked tough questions. What happens to patent rights, post-merger cross-check Q3 numbers with supplier invoices? It wasn't amateur work. It was the kind of audit-level reading Nate rarely saw, even from his lead counsel. There was no name attached, just 3 words in the subject line. From S. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. She hadn't been idle, she hadn't asked permission, and she certainly hadn't asked to be underestimated. He looked around his office, the space that had always belonged solely to him. For the first time, it didn't feel untouched. Outside, the wind moved the branches of the maple tree against the window, casting thin lines of shadow across the desk. He didn't sleep that night, not because of the numbers, but because for the first time, he wondered what else she'd seen, what else she already knew. It was raining in Midtown when Nate left the boardroom at Ellsworth Tower that evening. The kind of New York rain that didn't pound, just lingered fine, stubborn mist, clinging to glass and collar. The meeting had run long, the usual debate over leverage and expansion, derailed by a disagreement about SharpTech's fiscal stability. But Nate's mind wasn't there, not entirely. By the time he reached the estate, the lamps along the driveway were already lit. They gave off a soft glow, like the house was breathing in and out, waiting for something. He handed off his coat and briefcase at the door, loosened his tie, and stepped into the dining room, more out of routine than expectation. She was already there. Soraya sat at the far end of the table, posture straight, hands folded on her lap. Her veil was different that night, not the thick ceremonial one from the wedding, but a finer black silk with a silver trim that hugged her face more closely. The lower half of her chin showed a clean line, soft and strong. She had changed nothing else, no jewelry, no perfume, just presence. Nate paused by the sideboard. Wasn't expecting company. She didn't smile. "You're not. This is dinner." He sat, slowly. The place settings were neat. The wine already opened. Not the vintage he would have picked, but one his father used to prefer. There was silence as their plates were filled by whom. Nate wasn't sure. He hadn't seen staff enter, only heard doors open and close, soft like breath. Then she asked, "Did you review the SharpTech deal?" He looked up. "Was that you?" he said. "The annotations." She didn't blink. Not annotations, corrections. Nate leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "You're not listed anywhere in our advisory roster. No security clearance, no credentials on record. That doesn't mean I don't see where things go wrong." He studied her. The calmness wasn't bravado. It was practiced. He was used to that kind of tone in meetings with auditors, regulators, people who never raised their voice because the facts spoke louder. Most wives, he said dryly, ask how your day went, not how your acquisitions are misfiled. Most wives get to choose their husbands. Her words didn't sting. They settled, like stones in water. He picked up his fork, poked at the asparagus. So, this is what we're doing now. Just honesty across porcelain. She didn't answer. They ate quietly. No music. Just the sound of forks, glass, and distant thunder outside. Occasionally, he glanced up, catching the curve of her cheek through the veil, the lift of her throat when she swallowed. When she stood to leave, he stayed seated. Watched. Your veil, he said softly, just as she reached the doorway. It doesn't make you invisible, not to me. She paused. He didn't expect her to look back, and she didn't. But her shoulders, steady as ever, shifted in the smallest way like something unseen had moved beneath her skin. Then she disappeared into the hall, and the room held its breath behind her. The wind hit the windows like a warning. A late winter storm had blown in from the coast, slapping against the east side of the Ellsworth estate with restless palms. Somewhere beyond the walls, branches scratched glass, gutters groaned, and snow began to fall in heavy, uneven sheets. But inside, the house held its breath. Nate stood at the top of the cellar stairs, holding an old brass key. The hallway behind him was dim. He hadn't been down there in years. The basement was where records went to dye outdated contracts, archived reports, and the long-forgotten remnants of his father's empire. He flipped the light switch. Nothing. Storm must have knocked something out. He sighed, pulled a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and headed down. The air grew colder, mustier. Boxes lined the far wall, labeled in his father's handwriting bold, all caps. One read NTL, Partnerships, 2008-2011. He opened it. Inside, file folders, yellowed with age. He wasn't sure what he was even looking for, maybe the original Ellsworth-Adisa contract, something to trace the decision to sever that alliance. He flipped slowly, half reading. Then something slipped from between two folders of photograph. It landed face up on the concrete. He crouched. The image was black and white, the edges curled. A conference room, long table, glass walls showing snow outside. A handshake between Charles Ellsworth and a broad-shouldered man with deep-set eyes and dark skin. Standing beside him, a girl, no older than 10, veil around her hair, green embroidered coat. She held a small notebook and stood close to the man's side, half in shadow. The caption, typed on the back, Geneva Forum, 2010. Charles Ellsworth and Dr. Suleiman Adisa, with daughter, S. Adisa, Strategic Advisor Lagos. Nate stared at the name. He remembered the forum vaguely. He had been dragged along during winter break, jet-lagged and bitter about missing basketball tryouts. He remembered sneezing non-stop during the dinner, and someone he hadn't thought of her face until now, slipping him a ginger candy from across the table. No words, just a small hand with quiet kindness. He sat down on the cold floor, the flashlight set beside him casting shadows across the walls. His thumb traced the corner of the photo. She had known him. All this time, Soraya had recognized his name, remembered that room, and she had said nothing. He thought about the way she'd moved into the house not asking permission, not seeking acknowledgement. He thought of her efficiency, the confidence with which she dissected business deals, reorganized chaos. She had entered not as a stranger, but as someone who had already done the math and made peace with the outcome. She hadn't revealed the connection, not at the wedding, not in their conversations. Why? Because it would have shifted the ground under him, and maybe she didn't want that. Not yet. Nate rose slowly, still holding the photo. He didn't know what he felt guilt. Maybe, or the beginning of something like reverence. He didn't go back upstairs right away. Instead, he walked to the safe in the corner, entered the code, and placed the photo inside. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because some truths needed silence before they could be spoken aloud, and some debts couldn't be paid in words. The conference room on the 12th floor wasn't where Nate expected to see her. The meeting was supposed to be small, just 3 senior advisors, the CFO, and himself. The agenda, a new community redevelopment initiative in the South Bronx, funded partially through Ellsworth's philanthropic wing. The kind of meeting where numbers mattered more than names, and outcomes looked good in press releases. He entered just as Paul, the CFO, was finishing a slide on estimated zoning costs. Then the door opened behind them, quiet, measured. Soraya walked in, holding a slim black binder. Heads turned. No one said anything. She didn't pause. She moved to the far end of the table, laid down her binder, and flipped it open. Nate didn't stop her. In under 5 minutes, she dismantled 2 faulty budget assumptions, suggested a partnership with a neighborhood nonprofit that no one at the table had heard of, and questioned the logic of investing in a development that displaced existing families to modernize the area. No one interrupted her. When she finished, she simply closed the binder and left the room. No apology, no explanation. Paul turned to Nate, half smiling. Well, she came prepared. On the ride down, Nate caught up with her in the elevator. You've done this before, he said. She didn't look at him. Before my father passed, we ran a learning center, scholarships, mentorships, financial literacy for first-gen kids, and after she finally turned, after Ellsworth Capital pulled its support, we lost the lease, and then the license, and then the students. Her tone was flat, but the echo of the loss lingered behind it like steam on glass. He didn't respond. What could he say that he hadn't known, that it wasn't his call? That night, long after the house quieted, Nate stood in the library, running his fingers along the spine of a worn leather notebook she often carried. It wasn't there. But when he reached for a thick volume on nonprofit regulations, a folded card fluttered to the floor. He picked it up. The ink was faded, the handwriting deliberate. At the top, Ellsworth Education Grant, application, 2007. His eyes scanned the lines. I don't want charity, it read. I want someone to believe that what I carry inside me is worth building on. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a door. It wasn't the writing of a child. It was the voice of someone already older than her years, already familiar with being overlooked. He stood in silence, holding the card like it might burn. In that moment, the air in the room changed. He realized he'd made a mistake, not just in how he'd entered this marriage, but in how he'd tried to measure her value with the same instruments they used in boardrooms' credentials, titles, line items. He returned the letter to its place, carefully, and for the first time, he wondered what she'd lost, not just in business or legacy, but in being attached to the name Ellsworth. She hadn't asked to be brought back into this house. But maybe, just maybe, she was here to reclaim something she had built long before he ever thought to look. The house woke slow that morning. Snow covered the lawns like spilled cream, and the roads beyond the gates of East End were blanketed thick enough to silence the usual hum of staff arrivals. An email from security read, "Power down in the south wing. External grid impacted. Generators holding for essentials only." Nate came downstairs expecting quiet. Instead, he smelled coffee strong, fresh, and something else, motion, not rushed, just intentional. He turned the corner toward the kitchen and paused at the doorway. Soraya stood alone, in the oversized Ellsworth kitchen, usually reserved for caterers and staff. Her black turtleneck peeked beneath a wool shawl. No veil this time, only the silk still wrapped loosely around her crown, like a habit of memory. She was bent over the center island, wiping a spill near the coffee station with a folded dish towel. 3 paper bags sat nearby, neatly packed, labeled in clear handwriting. One read, Edison, driver, diabetic. Another Lena, front desk, vegetarian. Nate stepped inside. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She didn't look up. No one needed me to. "I'm still here." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't bitter. It was just fact. Said like someone used to arriving before the room remembered to call her name. He walked over slowly, took a clean towel, and without speaking, wiped the other end of the counter. They stood side by side for a long beat. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the boiler, her breath steady. his a little less so. By noon, the snow had tapered, and Nate was due at the investment summit streaming live from Frankfurt. The connection had been spotty, so he and Soraya went to the estate's technical suite, a room Nate rarely entered. When the screen went black mid-presentation, Soraya moved faster than anyone else. She bypassed the administrator login, opened a backdoor patch Nate didn't know existed, and rerouted the feed within 30 seconds. The IT supervisor blinked. "Where'd you learn systems like that?" Soraya gave a quiet smile. On the road to not being ignored, Nate looked at her, then really looked, not as an interruption, not as an enigma, as someone who had walked through fire and brought her own bucket. As they exited, a junior strategist whispered to him in the hallway, "Just saying, sir, you two doesn't feel like a contract marriage anymore." Nate gave a small, wry laugh, not out of dismissal, just surprise, because for the first time, he wasn't sure he disagreed. That evening, the snow melted in patches along the driveway, leaving streaks of wet black stone. He passed Soraya on the stairs near the library. Neither spoke. She was carrying a stack of old reports, barefoot, the shawl still wrapped tight. She didn't flinch at his gaze, and he didn't look away. The March board meeting started like any other, with the subtle choreography of power. Suits settling into leather chairs, tablet screens unlocking in quiet sequence, coffee arriving just as the room reached 72 degrees. But that morning, the attention didn't fall on the spreadsheets or on Nate. It fell on the woman sitting at the far end of the table. Soraya didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When the CFO finished a long-winded forecast on capital reallocation, she slid a single page across the lacquered table. "Your model assumes a 4.1% retention rate increase," she said. "But customer attrition in Q2 last year was 6.3%. You're misreading the base. That affects everything downstream." The room hushed. The CFO blinked, then, reluctantly, nodded. A gray-haired investor near the door leaned toward Nate and asked, too loud to be subtle, "Who is she exactly?" "She has a role on the board." Nate didn't answer right away. He watched Soraya instead. The way she calmly flipped a page, her hands steady, her back straight. The veil still covered her face, but her presence was unmistakable. After the meeting, murmurs followed them into the hallway, some curious, some cautious. That night, they were scheduled to attend a donor gathering at the Palm Court inside the Plaza Hotel Ellsworth Foundation's annual Circle of Influence. Nate came down the stairs, dressed in a navy tuxedo, hair still damp from a rushed shower. Soraya was in the study, her head bent over a folder of notes. She hadn't changed. "You're not coming?" he asked, standing in the doorway. She didn't look up. "You don't need me there." "That's not what I asked." A pause. Then she closed the folder gently. "I don't need to step into your world to prove anything. Nate, I know," he said. His voice was softer than she expected. "But what if I asked not as your husband, but as a partner?" That stopped her. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. The veil was different again, lighter, cream-colored silk with a delicate border. Through the soft weave, her eyes met his, searching. She said nothing at first. He didn't rush her. Then, after a long moment, she gave the smallest of nods. Not a surrender, a choice. They didn't go to the event that night. Instead, they sat by the fire in the study, folders spread out between them, debating the impact of interest rate shifts on long-term grants. At one point, Nate poured her tea without asking how she took it. She didn't correct him. When the cup was half empty, she said, "Too much sugar," and drank the rest anyway. Later, as the fire faded and the room dimmed, Nate stood and reached for a throw blanket on the side chair. Without speaking, he draped it around her shoulders. She didn't look back, but he saw her hand tighten around the cup. The chandeliers inside Lincoln Center sparkled like falling frost, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Outside, the banners read, "Art for All, a Future in Color." Inside, The guests shimmered in silk and velvet, champagne flutes clinking to the rhythm of money and admiration. Soraya arrived at Nate's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a slate-gray gown, simple, fluid, but it was the veil that drew every gaze. Soft chiffon, edged with silver thread, draped across her features, not to conceal, to define. They entered through the main foyer, past a mural of dancers mid-leap. Nate nodded at acquaintances, offered the occasional half-smile, but his attention stayed with her. People turned, some stared, others whispered. She didn't flinch. They reached their table near the stage. The name Ellsworth Foundation gleamed on the plaque, second only to the headline sponsor. As Soraya took her seat, Nate noticed the event coordinator's glance a pause, a tight-lipped smile, the kind that measured worth in headlines, not presence, but she said nothing. A few tables away, Congressman Harlan raised his glass, leaned toward a lobbyist beside him, and spoke just loud enough. "Well, I suppose we should thank the mystery wife. No one's looking at our spreadsheets anymore." The words floated out like smoke, dry, smug. Nate stood up, no mic, no warning, but the room heard. He didn't shout. "She's not here to be looked at," he said. "But since you brought it up, her veil isn't a wall. It's a mirror. If you see something unsettling, maybe ask yourself why." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Soraya looked at him, her eyes wide, not in fear, but in something more fragile, recognition. He sat back down. She didn't speak, just reached for her glass, fingers steady. The rest of the night unraveled slowly. Conversation resumed, but in a different key, softer, less assuming. A pianist began a set of Ellington pieces in the corner. When Soraya rose to walk to the back gallery, Nate followed. By the window, overlooking the plaza, a young reporter from a digital arts magazine stepped near. She spoke gently. "Sorry to intrude. Just, Soraya Adisa, is that the same strategist from Lagos in 2010? You led the education equity brief, didn't you?" Soraya didn't answer. The reporter glanced between them, then backed away with a quiet thank you. But in that moment, Nate's hand brushed against hers. Just enough. Just long enough. "I didn't know anyone saw that," she murmured. "I think people are starting to," he said. She turned back to the glass. In the reflection, their figures stood side by side, veiled in light and shadow. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ellsworth Tower, casting long amber streaks across the polished mahogany conference table. Nate sat with the firm's legal team, documents spread out in neat piles. The air was heavy with dust and silence. The meeting had started with routine asset reviews, but somewhere between line items and annual amendments, a sentence came alive. "Terminate support to Adisa Foundation. Directive from Charles Ellsworth." The senior clerk read aloud. Nate didn't speak. He stared at the memo, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Around him, no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't question it. These were just decisions, old lines inked in corporate records. But to Nate, that sentence didn't feel like a line. It felt like a crack. He dismissed the team earlier than usual and drove back to the Long Island estate in near silence. His reflection on the side window of the car seemed unfamiliar, like someone still struggling to catch up to the version of himself he was expected to become. The house was quiet, too. No music, no footsteps, just the hush that sometimes follows snow or secrets. He found her in the west room. The fireplace wasn't lit, but a small desk lamp threw a warm halo onto the chair where Soraya sat. She was reading something thick-bound and worn, the kind of book passed down, not purchased. Nate stepped into the doorway. He didn't ask to join her. "You ran Adisa Foundation," he said. She looked up. Her veil that night was soft ivory, a quiet contrast against the shadowy walls. She closed the book gently. "I did. We found the internal memo. It was 2011. The directive came from your father," she said, finishing for him. "Yes, I know." Nate moved a little closer. "Not too much. I didn't know. I believe you, she said, her voice even. But you are not just someone unaware of the past. You are the heir of it, the one who continues its name. He swallowed that like something bitter. He wanted to protest. He didn't sign that order. He didn't choose that silence. But the weight of his name, his company, the power it held, it wasn't innocent either. I don't want to be that man, he said quietly. She stood up, slow and graceful. For once, the veil caught a sliver of light just enough to reveal the line of her jaw, tight with fatigue, not anger. You married me, Nathaniel, not to rewrite history, but to fulfill a clause in it. I accepted that. But don't call me your partner if you still see me as the remnant of a mistake your legacy made. He didn't respond, couldn't, because the truth in her words was too sharp, too precise. She walked past him, her presence leaving the scent of quiet resilience in the air. At the door, she paused, hand on the frame. And don't confuse guilt with respect, she said. They may sound alike when spoken, but they feel nothing alike when lived. Then she was gone, her footsteps soft but final. The week drifted by like fog on a cold river, silent, unbroken. Soraya no longer joined the morning briefings. Her chair in the boardroom remained empty. Her name, unspoken. Nate noticed, of course, but he didn't knock on her door. He didn't ask where she'd gone. Instead, he began doing things no one told him to do. On Tuesday, he placed a call to a number buried deep in Ellsworth's archived donor records. A man answered with a cautious tone. Carl Jefferson, former director of the South Bronx Community Initiative, the last recipient of an Adisa Foundation grant before it was cut. Nate introduced himself without title, no assistant, no preamble. I'd like to restart the center, he said plainly, anonymously, if possible. Carl paused, long enough to make Nate wonder if the line had gone dead. We don't need charity, Carl said finally. But we do need roofs that don't leak, and power that stays on. You'll have both, Nate said, then quietly added, and the name on the contract will be yours and hers. Carl didn't respond. But the silence this time felt different, like a space that had made room for something new. On Wednesday, Nate drove to Yonkers. No convoy, no press. Just a dark coat, a scarf, and a man walking alone up the front steps of a modest home, shaded by an overgrown elm. Soraya's mother opened the door with eyes that saw through the layers. He didn't bring flowers, just a folder, financial restructuring plans, new scholarship drafts, and handwritten notes. He stood in the threshold, held out the file. I want to fix what we broke, he said, but I don't know if I'm the right one to do it. Her mother didn't reach for the papers. She looked at him with the kind of calm that life and loss can forge. My daughter, she said, doesn't need to be saved. She needs to stand beside someone who doesn't make her feel like she's shrinking. That night, Nate sat alone in the dining room. No silver service, no staff. Just him and a single envelope on the table, addressed to himself in clean, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a message from Soraya, not written in words, but in action. It was a copy of the original grant agreement for the South Bronx Center, amended, signed, with her name typed in clean black ink, Community Representative, S. Adisa. Nate didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just ran a thumb slowly along the paper's edge, like it might tell him what came next. But when he folded it and placed it gently on the table, his hand paused and stayed there, resting. The boardroom at Ellsworth Capital was colder than usual that Monday, not from the temperature, but from the silence that followed Nate's entrance. He didn't wait for the minutes to be read or for the agenda to roll out. He stood, adjusting his cuff once, then looked around the table with a clarity he hadn't worn before. I want to update you on a financial decision. He began. Last week, a grant was restructured to reopen the South Bronx Community Initiative. The funding came from a private source. That source was me. Chairs creaked, eyes shifted. Why asked Margaret Sloan, head of portfolio risk, her voice polite but firm. That initiative was cut by your father for a reason. Nate nodded. Yes, because he believed it didn't align with our return metrics. But I'm not my father, and I refuse to uphold a legacy I don't believe in. There was a beat of stunned quiet. Then someone murmured, "So, what exactly do you believe in?" Nate glanced briefly toward the hallway camera. He knew Soraya was in the adjacent room, watching the live feed. "I believe in repair," he said, "not as strategy, as responsibility." He didn't wait for applause. He just sat back down, opened his folder, and returned to the day's work. In the next room, Soraya stood by the wall, arms crossed loosely, her face unreadable. The screen in front of her still showed Nate's profile, the sharp line of his jaw set in something not quite anger, not quite shame. Later that night, when the office had emptied and the lights in the tower flickered to motion sensors, Soraya appeared at his door. She didn't knock, just stepped in. He looked up, startled for a second, then quietly closed his laptop. "I heard what you said," she began, "and I need to tell you something too." Nate stayed still. "I don't forgive you." "Not yet," she said, "and maybe I won't. But I don't want to forget the way you looked at me that night at Lincoln Center." He said nothing, but his hand, which had rested near his pen, curled into a fist, then loosened again. Soraya didn't step closer. She didn't need to. Sometimes, the distance between two people shifts without either of them moving. The morning air over South Bronx was crisp with late spring. Children's voices rose above the clatter of folding chairs, and sun cut through the gray buildings like a quiet kind of grace. Outside the newly repainted community center, the words on the sign gleamed in fresh navy blue, Adisa Ellsworth Learning Initiative. No spotlight, no press banners, just families walking in with quiet hope, and volunteers in old sneakers laying out art supplies, workbooks, and trays of coffee. Soraya stood still for a moment at the doorway before stepping in. The last time she'd crossed this threshold, her hands were smaller, and her heart heavier. Now, she held no folder, no title, just the memory of a girl once given a seat when the world offered none. In the largest classroom, now a shared space for literacy workshops and weekend clinics, Nate waited by the far wall, helping a staff member mount a corkboard. His sleeves were rolled, his shoes scuffed from walking 4 blocks to help haul donated tablets from the van. No suit, no fanfare, just presence. When the short welcome ended and a volunteer asked Soraya to speak, she hesitated, then stepped forward with a calm steadiness. "I grew up a few blocks from here," she began, voice even. "And I remember sitting in a chair just like these. Someone I never met made sure that chair was there when I needed it." She paused. Let the silence breathe. "Today, I'm standing here not because I was special, but because someone made room. This place, it isn't charity. It's memory made visible. I'm just repeating what was once done for me." There was no applause, just nods, the kind that come from those who understand things in their bones. Later, while children scribbled under a banner that read, "Career Dreams," a boy no older than 9 approached Nate, tugged at his jacket. "Are you coming back?" he asked. Nate crouched, met the boy's eyes. "If there's still a seat left, I'll take the one in the back." From across the room, Soraya turned at the sound of the boy's laughter. Her eyes met Nate's. She didn't smile. Not exactly, but her face softened, the weight behind her gaze quiet for the first time in weeks. They didn't speak again that morning, but as they walked through the hallway side by side, handing out name tags, adjusting a tipped easel, their steps were in rhythm, not because of who they'd been, not even because of who they might be, but because, for once, what they were building no longer required permission from the past. Late March brought a shy warmth to the Bronx, the kind of warmth that slipped between buildings and settled on windowsills without asking. Inside the newly added wing of the community center, the air still held the scent of new paint and hope. That afternoon, Soraya moved quietly through the corridor, clipboard in hand, She was checking the supply layout for the new sensory skills classroom, a space built for children on the spectrum. The walls were soft yellow, the corners rounded, the shelves low and filled with objects meant to soothe. A small boy, no more than 4, with deep brown eyes and tight coils of hair, suddenly darted from a beanbag chair. He wrapped his arms around Soraya's skirt and clung tightly. "Mommy," he called, voice full of simple belief. The room paused. A volunteer started to rise but stopped when Soraya gently bent down, her hand steady on the boy's small shoulder. "I'm not your mommy," she whispered softly, eyes kind. The boy blinked up at her, confused but calm now, still holding on. When Soraya looked up, Nate was standing at the door. He hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound, but the folder in his hand had dropped slightly, and his eyes didn't move from her face. It wasn't the boy's voice that had struck something in both of them. It was the way Soraya hadn't pulled back, the way she had simply stayed, offering presence without question, warmth without fear. The child soon returned to his beanbag, distracted by a teacher's voice and the lure of picture cards. But the quiet moment lingered in the space between them. Later that evening, Soraya returned to the Ellsworth estate. The sun had dipped below the garden hedge. Her mother was waiting on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl, sipping tea as if she'd been there for hours. Soraya sat beside her without speaking. It was her mother who broke the silence. "You know," she said, "he's been following you for a long time, not just since the wedding, since the day you chose silence, waiting for someone to recognize your worth." Soraya didn't reply. Her gaze was fixed on the dusk, unfolding over the lawn. Her hands lay still on her lap, fingers curled just slightly inward. "You've never needed anyone to validate you," her mother continued, "but that doesn't mean you don't want someone who sees you without the proving." Another silence. Then, gently, "Do you love him?" Soraya's breath caught slightly, the way it does when a truth sneaks up on you, not with force, but with clarity. "I don't know when I started trusting him," she said quietly, "but I did. And now, I don't want to go back to not trusting him." Her mother smiled, just barely. Then that's the beginning of love, not the fireworks, just the silence that feels like home." The porch creaked as a breeze passed through. Somewhere down the hallway inside, footsteps echoed and faded. Soraya didn't look up, but her heart had shifted slightly in the direction of someone waiting. The spring board meeting of Ellsworth Capital had always been a formal affair. Sharp suits, tighter smiles, and an air of polished tension. But that afternoon, a different current moved through the room, and everyone felt it before Nate even stood. He cleared his throat once, brief but steady. Then he looked toward the row of board members and said, "I'd like to formally nominate Soraya Adisa as strategic advisor to our Sustainable Development Fund, effective immediately." There was silence, brief, but sharp enough to cut through air. Then came the first voice. Harold Pierce, one of the longest-standing members of the board, leaned forward. "Nathan, you're recommending your wife," he said, dry and pointed, "a person who's neither been vetted by us nor even made her identity publicly transparent." Across the table, someone else spoke without raising their voice. "She's the daughter of Idris Adisa, the man your father fought tooth and nail to eliminate from global investment platforms. Are we rewriting history now?" A soft murmur followed. No one raised their tone, but their words struck heavy. "And this scarf she wears," another said, quieter, but more piercing. "Is that just personal preference, or another layer of mystery we're being asked to excuse?" Nate didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, but he did meet every single eye in the room. "I'm not asking for your permission," he said simply. "I'm informing the board of a decision, one based not on sentiment, but on performance, on clarity of insight, and yes, on trust." He let the silence stand. If her face being covered keeps you from seeing her value, then maybe it's your vision that's clouded. By the time the meeting ended, no formal vote had been cast, but the room had split. Some nodded silently, some looked away, and the news leaked by sundown. That night, Soraya sat alone in the house library. Not angry, just quiet. There were things that had no name: fatigue, exposure, a kind of exhaustion that came not from running, but from being seen when you didn't ask to be. The television buzzed faintly in another room. Commentators speculated. Headlines popped up: power play or true partnership, the hidden wife, now leading the money. She didn't respond, not to the news, nor to the vibration of her phone, nor to the sting in her chest. Then footsteps. Nate entered without words, carrying a folder. He placed it gently on the table before her and took one step back. Letters. From Bronx community leaders, from school principals, from startup founders, all recipients of small, quiet help through the fund Soraya had helped reform, all saying the same thing. Keep her there. She sees us. She doesn't have to show her face. One note read, "She's the first person who ever looked at us." Soraya didn't speak. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the paper stack. "I'm not asking you to fight this alone," Nate said. His voice was low, the way people speak when they mean it more than they understand it. "I don't need you to remove the scarf. I need you beside me when we start over. Not just the company, everything." He sat down, opposite her. No grand gesture, just presence. "I'm not choosing between you and the firm," he added. "I'm choosing the version of both of us that I still believe in." She finally looked up. Her eyes met his, and this time, she didn't pull away. Snow had fallen earlier that afternoon in Manhattan, soft and steady, leaving a quiet shimmer across the sidewalks. By the time guests began arriving at the year-end gala for the Community Arts Foundation, the entrance of MoMA was already lined with footprints and anticipation. Inside, the hall was hushed, not out of reverence, at least not yet, but out of curiosity. Everyone had heard she would be there. Most had assumed, privately, she wouldn't step into the light. But when the side door opened and Soraya appeared, there was no scarf, no veil, no barrier. She wore a simple white dress, long-sleeved, clean lines, nothing to distract from the woman herself. Her hair was pulled back, and her face sharp, poised, resolute, seemed almost to still the air as she walked past the tall glass panels toward the stage. No camera flashes, no whispers, just the sound of her heels against polished floors. She climbed the few steps to the podium. Behind her, a wall of light from the museum's installation glowed soft yellow, framing her in a warm, subdued halo. She didn't hold notes. She didn't look at the teleprompter. She simply stood, waited, and then began. "I was told once that if you don't show your face, people won't trust you." She let the silence hold, not to dramatize it, but to give it room to breathe. "I didn't cover my face to hide. I did it to listen, to stay long enough in a place without being told who I am, and maybe, just maybe, to be known by what I do before anyone decided if I deserved to be seen." She scanned the room slowly, no hesitation in her gaze. "Tonight, I choose to show my face, not because I owe anyone clarity, but because I no longer fear being misunderstood. I've learned something standing just out of frame all these years. What's invisible to the powerful is often the lifeline for the ones they overlook." A few chairs shifted, a quiet cough, then stillness again. "I'm not exceptional. I'm not rare. I'm not the only woman who's ever walked into a room wondering whether she's being welcomed or weighed. I only did what any person does when they've been locked out long enough they built their own key." There was no applause yet, just breath held tight in hundreds of lungs. She continued, softer now. "I wasn't waiting for a stage. I was waiting for a moment that wasn't about me. And this room full of art teachers, youth mentors, musicians who volunteer in subway tunnels, this is that moment." The silence broke, slow at first, a single clap. Then a second, then many. The room rose, not suddenly, but like a tide coming in, gentle, irresistible. Even a politician known for publicly dismissing her stood and bowed his head. Backstage, Nate had been watching through the gap in the curtain. He hadn't moved the whole time. He didn't clap immediately. His hand stayed at his side, fingers curling slowly until they were closed. This wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was clarity. He wasn't watching the woman he married. He was watching the woman he now knew he needed beside him if he ever wanted to build something that truly lasted. It was a quiet Saturday in the Bronx. Spring hadn't quite arrived, but the air had softened, and the windows of the community center were cracked just enough to let the street sounds drift in laughter. A distant saxophone, the occasional honk from Grand Concourse Avenue. Inside. The hall buzzed with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The children's art show had been Soraya's idea. No judges, she'd said. No rankings, just expression. Paintings covered the walls, crayon landscapes, stick figures with capes, poems scribbled in marker. In one corner, a photo exhibit honored the past. Among the images, one stood out, a grainy black and white shot of Soraya, no older than 20, standing beside her father at the Geneva Policy Forum. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, her chin tilted with a conviction still visible in her now. Below the frame, a single sentence. Dreams don't die. They wait to be handed forward. She didn't linger long at the photo. Today was not about nostalgia. She moved through the hallway slowly, stopping to listen, never rushing. A teacher showed her a portfolio of a student with selective mutism who had started drawing detailed cityscapes. A mother pulled her aside to say her child had come home wanting to paint every night, and then, quietly. A boy no taller than her waist reached up and tucked a folded paper into her palm. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was a drawing, two figures standing beneath a sprawling tree, one tall, with square shoulders and a soft smile. One elegant, her arms open, no scarf, no shadows. Between them, a giant red heart that touched the edges of the page. No words. She didn't need any. Across the room, Nate was bending over a table, helping a student tie a ribbon around their display board. He wore an apron too small for him and had a smudge of glue near his elbow. He looked up just as Soraya did. Their eyes met. Nothing spoken. But the hallway around them seemed to fade for a beat, like it knew. She walked toward him, not with hesitation and not with grandeur, just a steady, unbroken walk. Her head held high, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a woman who had lived enough to stop asking the world for permission. Near the last table, a small wooden sculpture stood on a pedestal barely knee-high. Someone, an anonymous donor. Perhaps one of the teens had carved a woman bracing herself against two swirling gusts of wind. Her arms weren't raised. Her hands weren't clenched. She simply stood, eyes open, unshielded. At its base, a handwritten note in pencil. Sometimes what we hide isn't fear. It's a chance for others to learn how to see not with their eyes, but with their heart. The last of the guests filtered out slowly, but Soraya and Nate remained, cleaning, laughing, offering second helpings of lemonade to stragglers. The room emptied by dusk, and as the janitor turned off the hallway lights one by one, he passed the gallery and paused just for a moment to watch them. She didn't look back, but he knew something had changed. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come from winning. It comes from being seen fully, honestly, and still being chosen. Not despite the scars, but with them. In a world that moves too fast to notice the quiet ones, she stood still long enough for someone to truly look. And he did. Not to fix her, not to rescue her, just to walk beside her, at her pace. Maybe that's the most radical kind of love there is.